A warm welcome to this evening's book discussion, which is the first in a series of 3 discussions on a trilogy on the history of the Peshwas. The era of Bajirao, which we are discussing today, is the first part of that trilogy. Bajirao Peshwa, as most of us all know, was an extraordinary phenomenon of the 18th century. In a span of just 2 decades, he had established the Maratha Empire over the length and breadth of the country by overthrowing the Mughals. So the book itself begins in the 17th century and takes the reader through the life of a young 20-year-old Bajirao, who was appointed Prime Minister by Chhatrapati Shahu after the death of his father, Balaji Vishwanath, in the year 1720. So we are so pleased to have with us, firstly, the author of the book, Dr. Uday S. Kulkarni. Please come up, Dr. Kulkarni. Dr. Kulkarni, a medical practitioner who retired as a surgeon commander from the Indian Navy, now practices as a surgeon in Pune. After obtaining a degree in communication and journalism from Pune University, he returned to his love for history. In 2015, he began writing The Era of Bajirao, which was published the following year. Besides maps and illustrations, the book is replete with timelines, introduction to the principal characters, appendices, references, a bibliography, a glossary, and an index, making it, I think, an ideal reference material. The next 2 books, which Dr. Kulkarni wrote in the series, The Extraordinary Epoch of Nana Sahib Peshwa and The Mastery of Hindustan, Triumphs and Travails of Madhavrao Peshwa, complete the set. Joining Dr. Kulkarni on the panel are Dr. Gaurav Gadgil. Please come up, Doctor. Dr. Gaurav Gadgil teaches history at the KJ Somaiya College. He is an avid historian, a reader, and an excellent public speaker. Joining them is Shri Amit Paranjape, a tech entrepreneur from Pune and the founder of punetech.com, an online portal for the tech and startup community in Pune, and also an avid reader. And he has participated in a lot of these book discussions of Dr. Kulkarni's books. So he is also an avid speaker. So in conversation with our esteemed panel, we have Ms. Soniya Khare. Please come up. Ms. Soniya Khare, copy editor, translator, former senior editor with Oxford University Press. She has been actively involved in the process of the writing and the creation of this as also the subsequent parts of the series. So ladies and gentlemen, once again, please join me in welcoming the panel for the evening as I request Ms. Khare to take the discussion forward. Just one point I'd like to mention, that the next discussion, that's on the second part of the book, will be on Wednesday, 29th March. You will all get invitations. If you are not on the mailing list, please request my staff to add you to our mailing list. Same time, same place. Thank you. So Soniya, take it forward.
Thank you, Arati. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to be here for this and participate in this book discussion today. There is a lot to be said and heard about Bajirao, so let me get straight to the discussion. I would like to begin by asking Dr. Kulkarni, out of the audience would surely like to know that after your training as a surgeon and after practicing as a surgeon, what made you turn to writing history, not just your passion?
Actually, if I look back for the last 60 odd years, I find that the turning to surgery was the aberration actually. because when I was in school, in a boarding school, in standard 6th, I wrote my first book on a school notebook which dealt with the Marathas and the Mughals. And then in the in 9th standard, I revised it thinking it was too childish. And both these notebooks I still possess. And then, of course, after the SSC examination, you start getting into medical college, studying for that. And once you're there, you want your post-graduation. So before you know it, three and a half decades have gone by. And it was only, but of course, your reading side on the side used to be dealing with these things. And I always had a feeling that there's something missing, or there's some kind of a bias or some kind of misrepresentation or something which has not been put forward by various authors who have dealt with Indian history in the second half of the 17th and the entire 18th century. Either because the sources were not available to them, they could not understand the Marathi language, and there's a voluminous, as Professor Gadgil will agree, amount of letters which are available, thousands and thousands of letters which have not been referred to by these people because they didn't have access to them, they didn't understand the language. And I thought that I have to set the record straight. That was the intention of beginning. So, starting from thinking that I'll probably write a monograph, which became a book in 2011 on the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Panipat. So that's how I began the writing with the Battle of Panipat.
But that's the other question that I would like to ask you. Your first book was on the Third Battle of Panipat, which was in the year 1761. So that's bang in the middle of the 18th century. And after that, did you, like, what happened? Had you planned the trilogy and you wrote about Panipat first, or how did it happen?
I had not planned anything. It was just a feeling of angst within me. In fact, that's what prompted me to do my postgraduate communication and journalism after I left the Indian Navy in Pune University. It was just the angst, the way public discourse is conducted. And from that, this first book came out. And I told my wife that nobody knows who's Uday Kulkarni, and I'm just writing this book and I'm sinking 1.5 lakh rupees of my own money. Think that this money is gone. I said, I don't play golf, I don't go to clubs. So I think you can well write off this amount. And she agreed. So that's how the first book came. Within a year it was sold. And that's what set me off on this journey. But when I first wrote that book, I never imagined I'd be writing anymore. It was the late historian Mr. Bedekar. I told him now I'll write the present book. In fact, it was after Panipat. I planned to write that book, which would have been rather early to write. I didn't have that many resources. I didn't have that much of knowledge at that time. But he told me, no, you go back to the start of the 18th century and begin again. So that's what led to this book, The Era of Bajirao. And then, of course, the chronology kind of took me forward to the next and the next. And I hope a few more in this slide.
Dr. Gadgil, I would like to ask you here. Dr. Kulkarni just mentioned, and it was a fact that there is a dearth of literature on the 18th century history, which is also being referred to as the Maratha century. And there might have been books in Marathi, but would you agree that there was very little in English which dealt with that century, and it was a kind of a neglected period in our history?
In a way, if we see, all the periods of transition which are there from one era to the other are often neglected ones. So even from ancient to medieval, there's something called as a late ancient or early medieval part that often has been neglected in the historical writings. We don't find that much of literature. The same perhaps is there from the late medieval to the modern. The period between 1707, that is with the death of Aurangzeb, till about 1857. The exact question many times which comes even in the classroom is, when does modern India begin? And we are having the same discussion with a cup of coffee. So does it begin with Aurangzeb's death, or does it begin with the Plassey battle, or with the Carnatic wars, or perhaps with the social reformers, or 1857, or the Congress's establishment in 1885? And there's a lot of debate and discussion which takes place, but sometimes 18th century often remains neglected in that. I would not say that there are no books available per se on the 18th century Indian history. There are. They're too academic in nature. Usually they're used specifically as resources for advanced studies. But in the domain of popular history, it remains neglected. And more so in the language of English, dealing with Maratha history, you have very few books which are there. The English books that we find on Maratha history predominantly deal with the time of Chhatrapati Shivaji. They deal with the Mughal-Maratha relations which are there. But once it comes to the Peshwa era, the amount of literature that is available gets less and less. So from the times of G.S. Desai in the more recent times, or perhaps M.J. Ranade, who had talked about the rise of the Maratha state when he wrote about it, you have very few good sources available for documenting that. So in that regard, when Dr. Kulkarni's books came about, they are indeed a welcome gesture, trying to document the Maratha history in English. In Marathi, again, there are books which are there, as you said rightly. And I'll just go a step further perhaps and say that even the Marathi books which are there on the Peshwa history are somewhere bordering on what can be termed as historical fiction. That you have many books which are there written from a novelist perspective. And where does the historical account end and the novel begins? There's a very thin line dividing it, and a general audience sometimes is swayed by whatever is written, considering it as the ultimate historical truth, which it may not always be. So in that regard, when this came about, perhaps this was a very fine balancing act done by Dr. Kulkarni in writing, because you do have the impressions of that novel style of writing which comes in with Narmada Uvacha, Reva Uvacha, etc. But still it remains deeply rooted in the academic style. So this was indeed a welcome gesture coming in English, which can reach a larger audience outside Maharashtra. Even though I am a Maharashtrian, born in Mumbai, raised in Mumbai, I don't read Marathi much. So many a times it became a challenge for me teaching Marathas and having to deal with literature which is predominantly in Marathi. So this undoubtedly is a welcome gesture.
Thank you, Dr. Gadgil. And here I would like to mention, since I have worked on this book as a copy editor, Dr. Kulkarni has taken great pains to make this book and his other books very interesting and accessible to the general reader. So his the details that he gives, the principal characters, the glossary and the lineage, the genealogical charts that he mentions. So it all becomes, otherwise it's so confusing. Who is this person? Who is that person? Who is he related to? It gets very confusing, but he's made it very, very accessible and interesting. And I feel that at times readers are not attracted to books on history because they are, they become like drab academic tomes, and nobody wants to go beyond the point. Dr. Kulkarni, I would like to ask you, beginning with the actual book and the era, you have said that this is not a biography and it is, a narrative of an era. Would you tell us a little bit about the time when Bajirao was given the robes of Peshwa? Was it like an easy transition from Balaji to Bajirao, and how was Bajirao's equation with the emperor, with Shahu?
Actually, when Chhatrapati Shahu was released by the Mughals in 1708 and he came down to Maharashtra, he had to contend with his aunt, who was actually the personal incumbent at that point in time, and he had to make his own place to get his throne, and he had to face resistance. So the first few people who came to help him at that time, one of them was Balaji Vishwanath. He was the Sena Karte, fairly, old by that time, 40 plus. In those days, 40 plus was fairly old. And he had been working here for almost 25 years before that in the Deccan. Now, when Shahu kind of lurched from crisis to crisis in the first few years of his kingship. And at every stage, he found that he needed the help of associates who had joined him in those years. And one of the people who were very staunchly supporting him was Balaji Vishwanath. So when Kanoji Angre, who was a very strong admiral, but he was also very strong on land, when he marched up the Ghats, took the fort of Rajmachi and threatened to march on to Satara. And when Shahu's Peshwa at that time went and confronted him, and Kanoji Angre in fact captured him and packed him off to prison. That is the time when Balaji Vishwanath stepped into his shoes and became the Peshwa in 1713. And in the next 7 years that he was the Peshwa, he kind of managed the affairs of the Chhatrapati so well that in one letter Shahu refers to him as Atul Parakrami Sevak, a servant of incomparable ability. And so he was very grateful to Balaji Vishwanath for setting his own affairs in order. And Shahu was a person who was very much conscious that if somebody has done something good for him or for his empire, he owes it to that person to make his son the next, give him the office. So immediately after Balaji's death in 1720, though Bajirao was not yet 20 years of age, and although he had been accompanying his father on campaigns since the age of 11, there were a lot of resistance to the appointment. But Shahu said that if you find that he's not much use or he's not performing, we can remove him later on. But Balaji Pant has done so much for me that it is incumbent on my part to appoint this young man as the Peshwa. And that's how Bajirao got his first appointment. And for the first few years, you find Bajirao going in Malwa and all these places on his own and campaigning and getting to know the land and the people and the politics of the region. And you find Shahu writing letters to him that you are going here, you are going there, you are not informing me where you are going. One day I will remove you from your job, then you will come to me running and saying, why have you removed me from my post, and so on. So that was in the first 7 or 8 years. So, and very much the elder statesman Chhatrapati and the young boy who had been appointed as a Peshwa, that was the relation in those early years. Till from 1728 onwards, Bajirao's career kind of took off, which of course we'll deal with in the subsequent question. So that was the relationship, and till the end, I mean, Bajirao died before he completed his 40th year. So Shahu was definitely having that slight apprehension about this man. He's unpredictable, he takes on, he's foolhardy, that's the impression his king had. But he came back successful from every campaign that he went. And so you find that those 20 years were a period of, until in last 2 years of Bajirao's time, you find Shahu even wondering, if I gave him the order, will he listen to me? So even those letters are there. So that's how powerful Bajirao had eventually become. But to his credit, he never once considered that he will replace the Chhatrapati and try to grab the power.
Exactly, I was about to ask you that loyalty was always to the emperor, and he never had ideas of rebelling and taking over the throne.
He continued to be loyal to the Chhatrapati.
So what would you say was his first big challenge, or the first big...
Actually, around that time, in the Viceroy of the Deccan, the Mughal Viceroy of the Deccan was the Sayyid brothers, and they fell out with the emperor. And because they fell out with the emperor, the Viceroy of the Mughals was here, Hussain Ali. He decided to take the help of the Marathas. Initially, Marathas had taken his help from putting down one of their rebellious Sardars. So he asked the Marathas that you lend me an army of 30,000 people, and I will pay for every day of their stay north of the Narmada, and I'll take them to Delhi. Now, when Farrukh Shah was the Mughal emperor, asked him, why are you bringing so many Marathas with you? They came up with some kind of a subterfuge that, we have got one of Aurangzeb's grandsons over here with the Marathas, and we are bringing him back to hand him over to you, and so on. And they used to have some caparisoned elephant, royal tents where they used to keep this chap. So this kind of a pretense was put up till they reached Delhi. And after going to Delhi, Hussain Ali and his brother Abdullah Khan, they deposed Farrukh Shah, appointed their own person as the emperor. So effectively, actually, the Mughal emperor, his power ended with Jahandar Shah in 1713. 1712, Bahadur Shah died, son of Aurangzeb, and then Jahandar Shah for 1 year he made merry for a year, and whatever his ancestors had earned over the last 200 years were actually destroyed in that single 1 year by Jahandar Shah. Farrukh Shah was brought and put in his place. So Farrukh Shah was a creature of the Sayyid brothers, and when he stood against the Sayyid brothers, they deposed him. And then the person who came in his place actually gave these sanads of Sardesh Mukhi, Chauthai and Swarajya to the Marathas. Now some people call it the Magna Carta of the Maratha rule, this is the authorization. Some people call it the Ghulamgiri Chet documents, that they accepted the Ghulamgiri of the Badshah. Now, as things unfolded in the years to come, the Marathas at that stage had still not got the vision that they can at one point in time actually control Delhi. So this was the aim right from Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's time. In fact, there's a letter by Chhatrapati Rajaram where he says that 3 lakh won have been kept aside for the capture of Delhi. He didn't have the money at that time, but he said that in one letter. So that aim of capturing Delhi was always in their minds. So this aim continued in Bajirao's time till finally they accepted this. They got the right to collect the Chauthai in the south and so on. And as the power increased and as the enemy became weaker and weaker and weaker, you'll find in the period of Nana Sahib, the Mughal emperor himself seeking the help of the Marathas to protect him. So that's how matters progressed in the first half of the 17th century. And Bajirao had a large part to play in that because, like his attack on Delhi, which we'll come to a little later, it was the first attack after nearly 180 years that the capital Delhi saw any invader coming at their doorsteps. So that was how it kind of built up over a period of time.
Dr. Gadgil, I would like to ask you, the fact that even Dr. Kulkarni mentions in his book that the Mughal emperors who followed Aurangzeb were insipid. So what kind of role did that play, do you think? I mean, not to take away any of the credit of Bajirao, but the whole scenario changing completely. So what do you think? How did that have an effect?
In fact, by the time Aurangzeb died, the Mughal treasury was already drained out. The Mughal empire's peak had reached during Aurangzeb's time. The decline also started during Aurangzeb's time itself. And as Dr. Kulkarni rightly pointed out, after Jahandar Shah being disposed of, you have the Mughal emperors who virtually became puppets of one faction of the Mughal court or the other. I think Satish Chandra has done fantastic work on the different factions that operated within the Mughal court in 18th century politics. And whenever there were rival factions, so whenever one faction would come up, the other faction obviously would move out of Delhi, try to make their own province stronger and autonomous and independent. So that is how in the 1720s, the hold of Delhi over different parts of the empire started weakening. And this is the time when we see the rise of what are called as autonomous states within the Mughal empire. So whether it is Awadh, which rose up as an autonomous state, or Hyderabad in the Deccan, which has been amply referred to in the book as well, or even Bengal, which emerged in the 1730s and 40s as a virtually independent state, only for namesake it was there. So definitely this strengthened the ambitions of the Marathas. And within the Maratha court as well, there was a big debate which happened between the Peshwa and the Pratinidhi, as has been again spoken of, as to whether we should go down south and capture lands where traditionally the Marathas had been in the earlier times, or should we go north? And the ambitions to conquer Delhi had been deeply there in the Maratha mind. So I think that was a logical course that followed eventually in the 1720s. But yeah, the weakening of Delhi, the weakening of the position of the Mughal emperor, the general decline which had started of the Mughal empire, all this definitely played a role in the eventual rise of the Maratha state in the 18th century.
But were they pulled back a bit by the fact that Shahu, he was in imprisonment and he had a little bit of a soft corner for the Mughals in that sense. So he never let Bajirao or later Peshwas go all out against the Mughals in that sense.
Definitely. In fact, it's wonderfully mentioned in the book as well. So you have a couple of places where the references come that Bajirao intended to have either the Chhatrapati himself or some other Hindu ruler being installed on the throne of Delhi. But you do have a reference which again comes of Shahu not wanting the Mughal emperor to be done away with, the Mughal empire to continue. So yes, since he was raised in the Mughal camp ever since the captivity began in 1689 or so, till 1707. So you do have some influence, some soft corner that was there towards the Mughals, and that must have played a role. But a question that is there, perhaps it will get answered eventually once the second book is finished, is perhaps Nana Sahib was not shackled by it after the demise of Shahu. So what happened then? Why did, after Shahu's death, you have a similar treaty that Dr. Kulkarni speaking about, that the Marathas would become the defenders of the Mughal empire. Why does that come about? So there was no loyalty or there was no emotional connect which was there in the 1750s. So what happened? That is a pertinent question that needs to be answered.
I forgot to answer your question last time. So you asked me when did Bajirao make his mark? So I was saying the Nizam of Hyderabad, the future Nizam, which ended in 1948, he came down, he wanted to have his own autonomous kind of kingdom, fiefdom. First of these autonomous fiefdoms happened in Bengal when Murshid Quli Khan took over that province, and then the Nizam at that time wanted to have his own province, so he came down here, Aurangabad and these places were there. In 1724, actually Shahu and Bajirao helped the Nizam-ul-Mulk, the future Nizam-ul-Mulk, to defeat the incumbent Mughal viceroy and take over the viceroyalty of the Deccan, and the emperor at that time kind of made a virtue of necessity and said, yes, now that he's won the battle, you become the viceroy. And Nizam also wrote very nice letters to the emperor, Muhammad Shah, that yes, I am very loyal to you. So Nizam's intention was very clear that he wanted to use the two factions of the Marathas, that's Satara and Kolhapur, make them compete with each other, at the same time take over the entire south for himself. And towards that, he's written some very interesting letters which I have translated from the Persian, where he writes to Muhammad Shah that these are the original Jagirdars of this place, but I have made them so innocuous that even Khul-de-Makan means the late Aurangzeb who is in heaven, even he could not achieve so much success in his time, but I have kind of made them tame and they're accepting all my orders. Now this is the impression he had in 1726 when he had Sambhaji's men and Shahu's men, both with him in a campaign in the Carnatic. And Bajirao was the only obstacle in Nizam's path to take over this entire kingdom. So when he found that Bajirao was not supporting his ambitions, he took Sambhaji onto his side. In fact, Sambhaji of Kolhapur was with the Nizam for almost 2 years, from 1726 onwards. And he told him that I will make you the undisputed Chhatrapati of the Marathas. Now when the Shahu came to know of this, he summoned Bajirao and all his leaders back to Satara and said that this is a situation has arisen and please come here and tackle it. And that led to the famous Battle of Palkhed. And this Battle of Palkhed was a battle which went on for nearly 8 months, from 1727, middle of 1727 till February 1728, where Bajirao left Pula to Nizam. He first went towards Aurangabad, went towards Burhanpur, without actually attacking those places, just threatening to attack those places, drawing the Nizam out of Pune, and then finally even reached Gujarat. He went to Chote Nagpur and all those areas. And finally, when he found that he suddenly came down Khandesh, and from there he started charging towards Aurangabad. At the same time, the strategy was to separate the Nizam from his artillery. And at Pultamba, there's a place where the Godavari could be crossed. And when the Nizam was crossing with his army over 3 days, first day he sent his bazaar, which set up a bazaar at Palkhed near Aurangabad. The second day he crossed with his own army. And the third day artillery was supposed to cross over. So before the artillery crossed the river, they chased off the entire bazaar, surrounded the Nizam and cut him off from all food and water. And the huge Nizam's army, without the artillery, could not face this Marathas surrounding them. And without food or water, they had to submit in 3 days. It was a completely bloodless victory. Most of Bajirao's victories are like that. They were mostly bloodless. Even later on, when he defeated the Nizam in 1738 near Bhopal, again it was a bloodless victory. He didn't really inflict any, that way he did not destroy his power, he just kind of made it ineffective. So no less a person than Field Marshal Montgomery, when he writes in his book, The Concise History of Warfare, he mentions it as a masterpiece in strategic mobility. So that's why the Battle of Palkhed has become so, and that was the first kind of mark that Bajirao has come on the Indian stage. And the defeat of a senior general like the Nizam, who had been undefeated till then, who had been brought up in the school of Aurangzeb, the old-fashioned orthodox manner of fighting. And his defeat, it resounded all over and that's what actually told the Indian subcontinent that somebody called Bajirao has come on the scene. And the very next year, his younger brother went to Malwa. In the battle there, he killed the Mughal governor, Girdhar Lal Bahadur. And after the monsoons the same year, Bajirao goes to Bundelkhand to rescue Chhatrasal from Muhammad Khan Pangash. And that famous couplet is there, Jo Gadgra Gajendra ki so Jat Bhai hai aaj, Bajira Jat Bundelan ki Bajira ko laaj. So that's what the letter from Chhatrasal is quoted very often. Actually, Bajirao already planned to go to Bundelkhand. So this is actually a story that Chhatrasal asked for them. He had already planned to go there. And just that this kind of happened at the same time. and he defeated Bangash and pushed him out from there, and that's Bundelkhand. And there's a letter from Balaji, who was one of the most able persons in his army, that our ream has reached the Yamuna. So that's in that after defeating Bangash, and he said our ream has reached. So that's why Bajirao reached the Yamuna and the Chambal in the north. And the south, he didn't make much of an impact because he was not allowed to go south. The Mamalat of south was handed over to somebody else during Bajirao's time. Though he made 2 campaigns in the south, he did not go south because the sovereign didn't allow him to go south.
Since you mentioned Chhatrasal, I would here like to ask Amitji a question. The entire social perception about Bajirao has been highly influenced by the movie, and which did not do justice to Bajirao the warrior. So, what would you say about that?
So I think, I mean, as was said earlier, right? There are 2 schools of thought when it comes to learning history. One is fact-based history, made a little bit interesting with characters like the Narmada, as Dr. Kulkarni has done. But ultimately, it's very close to the truth, right? Where you have references, letters, actual treaties. And then there's the other school which says, can we take a little bit of creative liberty and write some novel and fiction around it? Now, there are defenders of that school too. I don't like that at all, and I hardly read any of that. But there are defenders of that school who say that your history gets very boring, especially for young people. So how do we make it interesting for them while taking some liberty? Now the problem is, and I can buy that argument to some extent, but the problem is that some liberty is a very grey area, and soon it becomes complete liberty. Since you asked about that movie, right? I have 2 views on it. I mean, if you look at Dr. Kulkarni's book about Bajirao, the reference to that whole episode on which an entire movie is made is probably less than 5% of the book. But when they make a movie about it, that becomes the entire life and times of Bajirao. So that sort of shows you the impact or importance of a specific. But on the other hand, when the movie came out, Shanwarwada in Pune did see a record footfall. So there were people, there were school kids, there were youngsters who had never, staying in Pune, I'm not even talking about people from outside Pune, who had never bothered visiting Shanwarwada in 20 years, 30 years. Suddenly everyone was interested. So did it have some good impact? I think it did. So again, that's what I said, you can sort of argue both ways. I for one will not prescribe to it, but I can see why it does play a role. If you look at, and Professor Gadgil also mentioned that the Marathi information or documentation about the Peshwa history over the last few decades has also been a little shallow, because we have gotten into these fiction novels, whether it was Rao, on which the movie was based, or Swami about Madhura Peshwa. When people read Swami, or many people here may remember Mumbai Doordarshan series from the late 80s, which was about Madhura and his wife Ramabai's, titled Swami, which was based on that book. Again, that entire series is about the 2 of them. And I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but if you read Dr. Kulkarni's latest book about Madhura, the reference to Ramabai in a 600-page book is probably 2 lines or 3 lines. So that should give you an idea of, to what extent have the two things drawn. So, and I'll make one more point, just to the last point that Dr. Kulkarni made. He has used a very nice line, if there's one line to capture Bajirao's strategy. I may not quote it exactly verbatim, but basically what he says is, he knew when to fight, more importantly when not to fight, and where to fight. And I think these 3 things define Bajirao's battle strategy at Palkhed or anywhere else. This whole strategy of when not to fight is very important, and when to avoid the fight, and how do you get things on your term. I think that was beautifully described on that line. Another point that you have in your book at the beginning is that famous line, and since we were talking about Bajirao and Shahu Chhatrapati dealings, you should talk about that statement that he makes about the tree is rotten and it's time to strike the roots. Why don't you talk about it?
That's a very famous saying, that strike at the roots and the branches will come down by themselves. But about Bajirao Mastani, I wanted to make a point that in the year 2000, Bajirao's 300th birth anniversary, there was a request sent to the postal department by the Philatelist Association to release a stamp in honor of Bajirao's 300th birth anniversary. And the reply they got from the government of India was, "Who is Bajirao?" So eventually that stamp was released in 5 years later, in 2005. And of course, Bajirao Mastani has done wonders for Bajirao. Today you never have to explain who is Bajirao. I only wish I had written this book 1 year earlier, before the movie came. It would have sold like hotcakes.
Dr. Kulkarni, one of the major issues that the Peshwa faced was a financial burden. There was a huge debt. And of course, after he helped Chhatrasal, and later you mentioned that he got 1/3 of Chhatrasal's kingdom, which amounted to about 36 lakhs, which you said. So, but before that, I mean, was there a huge struggle, and how did that the burden of those debts affect the campaigns? Because it was not his personal debt, it was all for the empire. But how did it affect the various forays into the north?
Actually, when a kingdom or an empire grows very rapidly, it sometimes outstrips the rate at which resources are pouring into the empire. And that is what happened in Bajirao's time. It was growing very rapidly, campaigns every year, paying 50, 60, 70,000 troops who were willing to go with him to any place, and staying outside Maharashtra for 1 year at a time, and they had to be paid. And in his case, it was a classical case of the buck stops here. Because Surendra Sen has very eloquently said that during Chhatrapati Shivaji's time, the treasury was a central treasury. And the king he earned the money, and he controlled the money, and he disbursed the money. In Chhatrapati Shahu's time, because he stayed in Satara most of the time, it was like as if the Chhatrapati had become a pensioner. And whatever was earned from the campaigns, a certain percentage had to go back to the Chhatrapati for his payment. At the same time, the armies had to be raised by the Peshwa. He had to make sure that the revenues gathered by the various chiefs in various provinces reach him after their expenses are taken care of, which did not always happen. It did not always reach the center, which was Pune. So in many ways, during this Peshwa period, it was as if, in 2 months' time, the buck stops here. So he had to not only pay his Chhatrapati, but he had to make arrangements with the army. He had to extract the money which his Sardars have obtained, and therefore personal debts were always he had to raise. You'll find that from the time of Balaji Vishwanath, 2 of his daughters were married into money lenders' families. And the reason was very clear that because from there they could do, before Panipat, of course I'm jumping the gun, Nana Sahib married a second time. Nobody knows the reason for it. But it's very significant that he married a Deshastha Brahmin daughter, and she was the daughter of a money lender. Because he was borrowing money, there are many letters at that time, he was borrowing money at 2 rupees a month, 2% a month interest for funding. But there are 4 Maratha armies in different parts of the country at that time. So money was always, and every Peshwa died in debt. And somebody had to say that I will take care of this. Dharnas used to be held outside the door. Somebody used to be, Brahmin used to be given money that you will sit at his door and fast unto death, to put some kind of psychological pressure, even on Nana Sahib, that you will pay the debt on time. So this kind of dharna was there in those days. So, but the money was not there, and this kind of. So Bajirao writes many letters that I have to go and break my forehead before my soldiers because I'm in debt, and I don't know why I got into the enterprise. And you, Ramendra Swami was the Swami, the religious preceptor. That you think you're a great man and you tell us go and do this and that, and we don't have money and we don't have this. So a lot of letters with a lot of anguish and angst in those letters that you find. So this was around this time. There's a very interesting story about Chhatrasal. When Chhatrasal was rescued from Muhammad Khan Bangash, and Bajirao was called to his darbar, and Chhatrasal had 2 sons who were sitting next to him, and he offered Bajirao a seat. Please come and sit here. So Bajirao wouldn't sit. He said, he kept standing. So he said, why aren't you sitting? So he said, if you offer me a proper place to sit, I will sit. So he said, you're like any other son of mine. So he said, you've got 52 sons, official and unofficial. And I'll be the 53rd. So at this rate, if you give me a share in your kingdom, I'll get 2 lakh rupees. I've already spent 14 lakhs on this campaign. So then he held him by the hand and brought him there and made him sit. I'll give you 1/3 of the kingdom. I'll give you 1/3 of the diamond mines of Panna, and so on. So this is mentioned as a story of how he got his returns. Even when he went to Udaipur and Jaipur, the way he paid in respect to Udaipur, because the Rana of Udaipur was supposed to be the, at least that was the dynasty from where Chhatrapati Shivaji was, the Sishodiyas. So he gave him all the respect, but at the same time he made sure that the South was paid on time. And so that way, very practical about getting the funds, and he had to get it because it was not for his, only for his personal expenses, but he had to look after the expense of the kingdom.
On that, Dr. Kulkarni, let me ask you a question on that. Some people have said that, but you can either agree with it or refute it. But one reason, I mean, if you look at the Mughals or some of the other empires before, or even the English later, to extract money directly from the end contributor who would be a farmer or to an intermediary chief who was then collecting the money. These people, the Mughals and later the English, were a lot more brutal. And you don't see that level of brutality from the Marathas. It's ironic that there were some Bengal writers who actually accused Marathas, and actually compared to what the English did later or the Mughals were doing before, you don't find any of that. Is that one of the reasons, potentially?
There are letters like this during the Mughal period where they had said that if the farmer doesn't pay his revenue, even if there's a famine, you can confiscate his land. You can, even there are letters about selling his family as slaves but to get the money. In the famous 1770 famine which took place in Bengal, there was no produce, but people were forced to pay by the East India Company. So these instances were there. But unlike these, if you find Chhatrapati Shivaji's revenue model, if there is a land which has to be developed or where there is a famine, he would say, I will give you a rebate in taxes for the next 4 years, and progressively I'll increase the taxes as you build up your agriculture. There are many letters which give you his information about his revenue policy. So here was a king who cared for his people, as I call it, because they were his people, and it was from those people that he obtained his strength. So that was set the kind of pattern for what happened in the later Maratha period, at least in the Maratha ruled regions. Now it was a tradition in the Middle Ages that if you want to put pressure on an enemy, you first go and ravage his districts. Now in Bengal, what happened, what Gangaram is described in the Maharashtra Puran, which actually is in the next book, but because you mentioned it, that you burn the granaries of the village. The idea was that even today the army follows a scorched earth policy. What you are seeing in the wars that are taking place all over the world is the civilian population is definitely affected. You can't have a war on a general scale purely in the battlefield and expect that the civilian population around you will not be affected. Now there is one person who wrote about it. So that authentic document is available for Bengal, and that's the kind of hammer held to beat the Marathas with each time. That here is a document which says that you guys did this in Bengal. But if you go back in history, this is a repeated. I mean, I have not seen any Maratha document which says that after winning a battle, 50,000 people were beheaded, as happened in Panipat, and their pyramid of their skulls was raised outside the tents of the Afghan chiefs. So this kind of cruelty and brutality against a
on that, on Bajirao, you can talk about how he said he's not going to burn Delhi.
Yeah,
in fact, I was going to ask Dr. Gadgil about that. That, you know, Bajirao at Delhi, we are talking about the way Marathas handle things. So, how would you say he was different from the others, you know, all the others who plundered Delhi and went away with the riches and absolutely left it in rags. But Bajirao just kind of stamped his authority that he could come there and show his strength. But he didn't do the kind of things that the other invaders did.
I think the idea of plundering enemy territories goes into the concept of what is called as a war state. And the Marathas was undoubtedly a war state. So war became a major source of revenue, kind of a revenue model which became difficult eventually to cope up with because you don't have these areas being directly governed, at least for the initial few years. And eventually when the rule was established, it became difficult. But when the Marathas came, yes, there was an ethical policy of war to a great extent that was followed. Even if you go back to Chhatrapati Shivaji's time, when you have Surat being plundered, not once but twice. Interestingly, you don't have the civilian population being troubled at all by any of the Maratha troops. The same we find eventually not only in Bajirao's attack on Delhi, which I'll come to, But even Chimaji Appa's attack on Vasai and the defeat of the Portuguese, you have the vanquished Portuguese, their family members, etc., being escorted back. So you do have a very ethical policy of warfare to a great extent. But the stories about Bengal are different. So you have, from a Bengali perspective, the Marathas are depicted in a much more negative light. You have the Bhosle clan, which was predominantly responsible for the incursions into Bengal, and you do have the plundering raids, which have had a more negative version of historical narration as opposed to the other parts of India. With reference to Delhi, when Bajirao came right up to the gates of Delhi to show the Maratha power, the reason why he did not plunder Delhi are many. One perhaps is because of the ethical policy, perhaps because he wanted to establish eventually his base in Delhi, and he did not want the resources of Delhi at that moment of time, perhaps we can argue. Secondly, as Dr. Kulkarni has also argued in his book fairly well, that he wanted channels of negotiation to remain open, that he wanted to ensure that his threat is felt. So when he approaches the negotiating table next time, he has an upper hand. So perhaps for that reason, you don't have Delhi being plundered as well. So, and however, you do have other areas which did see some element of plundering. In fact, in the book also we find references of different groups, since financial management was the issue which I think the Marathas generally lacked in the 18th century. And it was the lack of fiscal prudence which was one of the important reasons, apart from the inner fighting which was there for the eventual downfall of the Marathas. That you have Pindaris who are also there. So you don't have direct payments, as Dr. Kulkarni has mentioned from primary sources, that after the battle used to get over, whatever loot they could gather from the battlefield in neighboring regions, that became their payment. So the Marathas, though followed an ethical policy up north or in the other parts of India as well, they were still looked at negatively from the other parts. So, which became difficult going years ahead when the 14th of January 1761 dawns eventually. So the Marathas had a 50-50 kind of a scale. So on certain elements you have very ethical policies being followed, but at the same time you have the vision of Marathas as plunderers, as who would come from the Deccan, who would loot different kingdoms or the empires and would go back eventually.
Just the whole principle of South that they followed was very simple. That if you agree to pay me at South in the first instance, I will protect you, not only from my own attacks, but from attacks by other enemies. So this principle was not laid down or not invented by the Marathas, it was invented by the Portuguese. When one of the kingdoms in the Konkan area were offered that liberty and they paid it south to the Portuguese, and when Shivaji Maharaj took over that state, he continued this policy at south, and he offered it to all the states that he captured, that whenever because you were getting stronger, the neighboring king was weak, he said, other enemies should not attack you and I will not attack you, you pay me an indemnity of, so your defense needs are taken care of, something like a NATO of those days. So when Alivardi Khan, the Nawab of Bengal, who was himself an usurper, this is the next book actually, when he took over the kingdom and people came to Bhosle's and said that this guy has come and taken over, the people, like Mir Habib was a minister in the previous Murshid Quli Khan's dynasty. He came to Bhosle and said, please rescue us. And that is how Raghuji Bhosle sent his army to Bengal. And he demanded Alivardi Khan that you are a usurper, you have got no right to this throne. If you don't want us to attack, they took Orissa from him. If you don't want us to attack Bengal, you pay an indemnity of 12 lakh rupees per year, which for 10 long years Alivardi Khan refused. Until he did not pay every year the Marathas attacked Bengal. In 1751, finally Alivardi Khan got tired of this and said, okay, I'll pay you 12 lakh rupees a year, and the Maratha attacks on Bengal stopped. 1751 to 1757, there were no attacks on Bengal until the English came in Plassey and took over. So the basic reason for this was that we offer you protection, pay us south. Now south again, the attack on Delhi which you mentioned too, there's a letter from an English factory record which I mentioned here, where Shivaji Maharaj says to the Mughal governor there, that your king has brought war onto my people, and therefore you must pay for that war. And the reason I'm attacking Surat is because the money, that was the richest Mughal port. So the money which I take from here, I will use to defend my people from your attack. You are the invader. So that was a rationale for attacking Surat at that time, in 1664. In 1670, of course, the reasons were different.
I think one thing, I don't know how much time we have, but one thing we should talk about, especially given that we are here in Mumbai, is someone who was probably the most core asset of Bajirao over 20 years, and that's his younger brother, Chimaji Appa. And I mean, if not for him, large parts of where we are at right now, well, maybe not this part, but the northern part of Mumbai, what was called Salsetta Shashti, would have remained with the Portuguese like Goa did. If not for the Desai campaign of 1739. And in the Bajirao book, Dr. Kulkarni has two chapters dedicated to that. And it's interesting that we say, I mean, most of Bajirao's battles were bloodless. On the other hand, this was one of the bloodiest battles of not only that era, but probably of the entire first half of 18th century. With I mean, the Portuguese had defended the fort very well, and there were a lot of casualties on both sides. Maybe Dr. Kulkarni briefly talk about that as well, because that's very much part of the book.
Yes, sure. And I would also want to, in brief, get your views on Bajirao's relationship with the Rajputs. It was not a very happy equation, but you mentioned Radhabai's pilgrimage, and you know that as a reflection of the respect that Bajirao had. So these two, of course, the Battle of Vasai, and also
actually, when Vasai, the reason, see, the English were in Bombay, but they were pure traders. The age they were living in that time, it was very important that somebody does not kind of Inquisition and so on had happened a little bit earlier. So that spirit of somebody imposing themselves on our religious practices or customs was very strong. And all those complaints used to come to the Peshwa that do something about these Portuguese who were in the northern Firangan, as it was called. And therefore, Chimaji Appa, who was a very orthodox, between the two brothers, he was more orthodox. So he decided, I will take it upon myself to liberate Sashti as well as Vasai. So in 1737, he liberated this Sashti, which is from Bandra to Borivali. And then he was called away because the Nizam-ul-Mulk, the battle took place at Bhopal. So there was a gap of an year, and he came back again in 1739 to fight with the Portuguese and evict them from Vasai. 12,000 Marathas were killed in the battle to liberate Vasai. That was how powerful the Portuguese defense was. If you go to Vasai, you will find that the fort is surrounded on three sides by water. There's only one access, and you cannot approach the fort and put mines under the walls because there's an open ground of 200 meters from which the Portuguese guns used to fire at the army approaching them. So the casualties were very high, to the extent that Chimaji Appa once mentions that if you can't take the fort, put me in one of your cannons and blow me up so I enter the fort. That is the way he told his men. Finally, with great efforts, they finally managed to put a few mines, and Malala Holkar was there, and Balaji. So a lot of people were there that time. So they finally managed to blast open. But the Portuguese, when they surrendered, Chimaji Appa was magnanimous enough to say that you can all leave with your families and your possessions, and you can go with your band playing onto the ships which were provided by the English to take them to Goa. So not that he immediately sent his army in and plundered the whole place, and that didn't happen at that time. So that was about Vasai.
the Rajputs.
Yes, the Rajput relations, actually Savai Jai Singh of Jaipur was initially very desirous of becoming the governor of Malwa. But when he found the Marathas had become so powerful that this is not going to happen, he gradually decided to began recruiting the Marathas onto his side. And he began advising the Mughal Darbar that let us use Bajirao to achieve our ends and let us give him what he wants. And towards this, Savai Jai Singh became a great supporter of the Maratha coming to the Mughals and getting Malwa also at that time. Now Udaipur and Jaipur were the two places which at that time were prominent, and out of which Udaipur, of course, being the place of Rana Pratap, was never helping the Mughals at any point in time, but Jaipur always was, probably because of its proximity to Delhi. So when Bajirao wanted Malwa to be ceded to him in 1735-36, he finally went there. But before that, he sent his mother. She wanted to go on a pilgrimage. And then she was treated royally at Udaipur and Jaipur and made to stay there for 1 month, looked after very well, escorted to Mathura. Muhammad Khan Bangash, whom he had defeated in Bundelkhand, further escorted her from Mathura to Gaya and Kashi and so on. So the entire Radhabai pilgrimage became a kind of a backtrack diplomacy which happened and showed the indirect power that Bajirao wielded and the respect he wielded over all the regions through which he passed. And after that he went to Udaipur and Jaipur, and his treatment of Udaipur and Jaipur both, there are two Rajput texts which are Vansh Bhaskar and Veer Vilod, which in Rajasthani language they describe what actually happened in those darbars. And of course there are others like Dastur Komwar papers are there, all of them which I have quoted here, which give the narrative of what all happened in Udaipur and Jaipur and so on. So in Udaipur, when they went to meet each other, the Rana was a very young man, he had just taken power. So he received Bajirao and he put 2 cushions for them to sit on, and Bajirao said that I will not sit on the same cushion at the same level as you, and he took a fly whisk and stood behind the Rana and started so he said, why are you doing this? He said, because this is the seat of Rana Pratap, and you are also the ancestor of my Chhatrapati, which is Shahu, because Chhatrapati Shivaji was supposed to have descended from the Ranas of Udaipur. So that's how he treated the Rana of Udaipur. Of course, he took the south and then he went to visit the Jal Mandir, which was a palace in the island. He said that somebody is trying to kill me, I will not tolerate this. Right now, pay me 3 lakh rupees. So they had to pay him 3 lakh rupees. So all the money he took. And then he went to Jaipur, where the Jaipur king probably thought that he will be given the same honor. But Bajirao wouldn't give him the honor. He sat on the same seat next to him. In fact, he even told him, according to Vansh Bhaskar, that I am the superior because you have cohabited and collaborated with the Mughals. And I have not, so I am the superior, but today I will give you an equal rank and sit next to you. So the Hindi version says, Janu ko Janu laga ke, knee to knee was kept, sat next to him, and he used the hookah and blew smoke. So that is what Bajirao did in Jaipur. So that was the difference between the way he treated these 2 kingdoms. Of course, he was a soldier. He may have been by caste a Brahmin, but he was a soldier, lived in the camp all his life. So his habits, you can't associate with his priestly birth. From the age of 11, when somebody is fighting, he develops a different set of habits. So he was like that.
I would now request Dr. Gadgil to give us an overview of the book and the tool. The tool that Dr. Uday Kulkarni has used of Reva Uvacha, which I think is a very interesting device, which comes in all of his books under different titles. But as someone who teaches history and who's seen the kind of other comparative literature on the Peshwas and the Maratha century, would you just give us a kind of an overall review of the book?
It's definitely. When it comes to the style of writing, as I said in the beginning, it's lucid, it's engaging, and it has brought the best elements of writing from a novel perspective into academic writing. So you have a thoroughly researched book based on primary sources, which are not just the traditional Marathi sources, but even from outside the province, so whether it is in Persian, whether it is in Rajasthani. So it's a fantastic addition which is there. And treading on these Marathi sources becomes a very challenging task, particularly Bakhars and Shakavalis, where you have different narratives, you have biased narratives many a times, sometimes outright fictional accounts which are created. So balancing all those things and then coming, because particularly the episode which a lot many people know, something Amit ji also mentioned about, is the Mastani episode, and there's so many conflicting narratives. So not only on that, but the others, for example, Dabhade Prakaran, which has been spoken of, there are so many different narratives which are there in different Bakhars. So balancing that out is a challenging task which has been accomplished greatly. 18th century Peshwa history, very, very, very few English history books of academic repute. So this is undoubtedly a valuable addition to that list, undoubtedly. So it's well researched. Now, apart from that, then numerous things which came about. One fascinating thing that I came to know about, something that was discussed a short while back, is Radhabai's whirlwind pilgrimage across north, which spoke about diplomacy, which spoke about perhaps what we can term perhaps as perhaps through to diplomacy, or the power of the Marathas, which was established perhaps by that time. And numerous other episodes, even the campaign in the Konkan, a very long drawn-out campaign, and undoubtedly the outright military genius that Bajirao was. Many a times, whenever the name Bajirao comes up, even in the classroom when teaching the course on history of Marathas, which we do in the third year BA, is that Bajirao's name is often taken along in the same breath with Mastani. And Mastani is just one small part. There's a lot more of Bajirao than just simply his association with Mastani. I'm not arguing her place in the Maratha history or in his life. She was undoubtedly important in his life, as has been also pointed out. But the military genius, the war of movements, the mobility aspects which are there, which has been documented well. So apart from the illustrations and the maps which are there, even the tables which are there of movements is something, as a history student, I found it very helpful as a tool. So when we teach about, Bajirao constantly moving with his troops, khas karke when it comes to the Battle of Palkhed, which is a classic strategic, maneuver to, outrun the enemy and catch him at the most vulnerable point. You have the exact movements which come about. It is not only good as a history student, but also when teaching history, it becomes a very effective tool. So they're the best elements which come up. But along with that, the copy editing has been wonderfully done. So there are, virtually none grammatical errors or typo errors which are there. Only in one small place, I think there are endnoting number errors which have come about. Baal ki khal nikalna hota hai na. So, and in one place, actually in the beginning, Reva Uvach, I think many people are already aware of the Bhagavad Gita and Sanjay Uvach and the importance of narration. So it was a very different take to have it in an academic book, because when I first saw Reva Uvach, and I thought perhaps this also is going to come in the same line, despite Satish Sani sir saying and Arati ma'am saying that it is a thoroughly researched book, and the first part that comes up is Reva Uvach. I thought this is perhaps bordering on historical fiction again. And I was, happily proven wrong by the end of the book. But it was a very good addition. But in the first Reva Uvach itself, I think it's the first one on page number 3 or 4, if I'm not wrong, there's a mention that has been made that no other king from the Deccan or the south had crossed the north and gone. So you have Rashtrakutas during the tripartite struggle who had done on multiple times. Though the Cholas went it from a different route, they did not cross the Narmada. But you do have that. So that's one small historical.
Stand corrected in the last 7 minutes.
Soniya, I'll just add 1 or 2 points on the book and the book style itself, right? So I think, and going back to the first discussion that we had about Panipat, I think there are 2 sets of people when it comes to Maratha history. There are many people outside of Maharashtra, and these days many in Mumbai and Pune, who have no understanding of Maratha history, especially in the 18th century, and that's very sad. But that's unfortunately the reality. So for them, Dr. Kulkarni's books are a great tool to understand at a basic level what this important chapter of Indian history was all about, for various reasons, and that's a separate discussion. This was not covered in our school textbooks, the NCERT textbooks, and that's a different discussion and debate. Let's leave that aside. But in Marathi itself, for people, and I've met quite a few of those over the last 10 years, who think they are experts on Maratha history or who have read a lot of Maratha history books, they have very strong views about Panipat. They have very strong views about Bajirao. They have very strong views about Bajirao Mastani. And this is based on some books that they have read. Even some of the non-fiction books in Marathi, and Dr. Kulkarni has mentioned some of them, including by the likes of Shezvalkar or Khare. Many of them have, even though they are non-fiction, they have taken a strong view, either for or against a leader. I mean, some could be very pro-Bajirao, some could be, same with Panipat. And so any Marathi person you would talk to Pune, especially someone who's interested in history, will have very strong views about Panipat. They'll say, they'll give you guaranteed, this is why they lost. And earlier I used to think about it the same way. After reading his first book, that's when you realize that history is never black and white. You can argue each side as vehemently as you can if you decide to be a lawyer. That's why pakhars are not good, because as Professor Gadgil mentioned, they often present again one view of whoever wrote it or what their king wanted to hear. So then, how do we learn history? So I think what I like the most about all of Dr. Kulkarni's books is he gives us information as detailed as possible, including the authentic letters, including the authentic treaties. These are typically a lot more valid than a bakhar, right? And gives you all the data, but then doesn't draw a conclusion. And I think, but keeps it interesting. I think that's a very tough job to do, making it interesting, yet not giving you any conclusions, yet giving you all the data. And then the reader has to make up his or her own mind of what it is. And the Panipat book literally, I mean, again, I'm jumping ahead, and that's true with a lot of Bajirao's battles as well. You draw your own conclusion and they could be different, but I think that's how history should be.
True.
Yeah, just a word about this, the Reva watch. When I wrote the first book, I wrote, as Sutradhar was the person who kind of held it together. So this began because when I did my journalism after I left the Navy, what newspapers today you see is the news has to be separate from the editorial pages. Yeah. Today you find the newspapers have got editorial mixing in the headlines, which should not happen. So the Sutradhar and the Reva watch give me some leeway to put some editorial comments in that. And every time I come up with something new which I have to really rack my brains with, because Sutradhar is over, Reva watch is over, then Vakyanavis is over, then now Dateline is over. So next time I have to think of something really new. Who's going to tell the story? And second part, which you mentioned was
about giving the facts and then let people decide.
So this was the reason why I don't like to add editorial comments. And of course, once you place the facts before people, I'm sure the people who are reading the book are intelligent enough to understand what is what. Doodh ka doodh, pani ka pani is a very famous phrase these days going around. So that way you can understand what is the actual, who's at fault, who has done what, and so on and so forth. And the purpose of writing the book in English was to take this history outside Maharashtra. Otherwise, you find Maharashtrians patting each other on the back. We went to Attak and we went to Cuttack. But nobody outside Maharashtra knows it. When I wrote the first book on Panipat, one brigadier who was in the Maratha line in front 3.5 decades, rang me up from Chandigarh saying that till I read your book, I didn't know Marathas fought at Panipat. So that is the level of ignorance which was prevailing all over the place. So
I think, again, coming back to social media, one reason we interact a lot is social media, and especially on Twitter, and we connect with people, historians, history enthusiasts all over India. And the sheer number of people, including some of the top authors now in India, I won't name them, but some of them are really top-selling history authors right now, young authors, and they're doing a great job. So many of them have communicated to me, and very directly to Dr. Kulkarni as well, that they learned so much and they were surprised that there was so much about 18th century Maratha history that they had no clue about. I think that single thing alone is probably the biggest contribution that Dr. Kulkarni has done. And I think all over India people should be reading the books, but I think we should start here for sure.
I think the biggest challenge has been there in communicating the ideas, as has been talked. So perhaps as Dr. Uday Kulkarni quotes, I think Duff towards the end, that Bajirao had the head to plan it and the hand to execute it. So perhaps it's the same thing that we can say about Dr. Kulkarni too.
Thank you, Dr. Gadgil. Thank you, Dr. Kulkarni and Amit ji. It has been a most interesting discussion. And
Are we taking some questions?
I don't think, yeah, no? Was there any relative?
Do we have a mic? Yeah, I think it's just here.
Sir, to make a Delhi as a seat of power was a vision for the Sultanate or for Mughals or for the English people, because they have a synergy of the thinking of the king and the army chief. But whereas Maratha failed or they didn't do it, is it because the Senapati and the Chhatrapati, they didn't have the combinations or the synergy of the vision to make Delhi as a seat of power and take it and make a Maratha empire for 100 of years.
Actually, the Marathas' base was in Maharashtra, in Pune. And as far as Delhi is concerned, it's the ancient capital of India. And the Mughals and the Delhi Sultanate and so on have ruled it for several centuries. But that's because they came from the northwest and they came and they stayed here. And Delhi was the most appropriate and the most convenient place for them to rule. Somebody even tried to bring it to Devgiri to become the center of the country. Now, as far as the Marathas were concerned, there are two reasons for not going to Delhi. One is that they want to control Delhi. They wanted to control who ruled in Delhi. And therefore, even in later years, as you'll come across in the later books, you'll find that the Mughal ruler reigned, but the Marathas ruled. Because the Mughal ruler, whether it is after Muhammad Shah or whether it is Shah Alam II, they were all puppets, they were phantoms actually. And the entire policy was laid down by the Maratha chiefs who were there at that time. So, and secondly, they didn't have sufficient number of their own people in Delhi to make it a capital. To take your power center, which is somewhere in Pune, Satara, Kolhapur and Maharashtra region, to come out of that and go and settle down in Delhi and try to create a power center there was very difficult in those days. We are talking about the pre-partition era, when you cannot imagine what Uttar Pradesh and Delhi was like. You go back to the pre-1947 period in the Mughal and Deccans, Delhi was like, when the Marathas went to Panipat, they were like fighting in a foreign land.
Actually, there's one data point that I always
So there was no reason for them to go and settle down in Delhi. And besides, Chhatrapati Shahu very clearly laid down when Nadir Shah attacked in 1739 and went back. There was a move to, because Bajirao could not have taken the throne because he had a Chhatrapati here, his own king. And he cannot go and take the throne in Delhi saying that I will become the king of Delhi. The Chhatrapati very clearly mentioned that I don't want to go and become the king in Delhi. In fact, he wrote a letter saying that there is greater merit in repairing a broken down temple rather than building a new one. So Muhammad Shah has been restored to his throne by Nadir Shah, and now it is our duty as the Amirul Umrah of the empire to help him and sustain his rule. Very clear-cut directive was given by him. So neither the king was desirous of going there, nor the Peshwa could have gone there. So who will go and sit on the throne there? Which is not a place which they had their power center.
Yeah, I think just one quick geographical point that I mention a lot is, and especially in relation to Panipat, but you can make that same point about Delhi because geographically it's quite close. When people were talking about Abdali coming to Panipat, I just looked at even today you can look at it with a Google map, even though it doesn't go across borders directly, you have to do some jugards to get that done. Kabul Panipat distance is significantly lower than Pune Delhi or Pune Panipat, and that's a plain route once you're down Khyber Pass. Whereas here you have to go via Narmada, you have to go via Vindhyas and Satpuras, and it's a tough path. So we have to realize that just the sheer distance for all these battles or for this control was a very tough challenge. It did become, again I'm jumping 3-4 books ahead, the current book that you're working on, it did become a little easy towards the late 18th century in the Mahatma Shinde era because he himself was sitting at Gwalior. But we'll go to that in a separate discussion.
Was there any relative of Shivaji Maharaj who continued to work for Adil Shahi or means his opponents? His step brother or someone, and fought against.
That was when his father was working for the Adil Shahi. But after his father, his other stepson was there, Venkoji Raje. He formed his kingdom at Tanjavur. But then after the Bijapur kingdom was dissolved, he became independent. So Tanjavur became an independent state after Bijapur was captured by the Mughals. And it remained like that till the British finally dissolved that state 150 years later.
Dr. Gurgani, first of all, thank you very much for the books. I got introduced to your work from the Maratha century, and growing up with NCERT, like Dr. Gadgil said, the transition was a blank space for me, but after reading the books, I was enlightened very much. My question is that may it be Bajirao Peshwa, may it be Nana Sahib Peshwa, or may it be Madhavrao Peshwa, all of them came to the helm of power at a very, very young age. And it always, I'm in awe when I think about that. And I wanted to know that while your research, did you come across about their upbringing, how they were brought up to hold such a great responsibility at such a young age?
They were taught from the age of 5 or 6. You will find letters written by some of the children of like Vishwasrao, who died at Panipat. His earliest letters you find were written when he was probably less than 10 years of age, but very mature letters. So looking at administration and letter writing, reading the scriptures, in fact there are some letters which advise the junior members, the younger members of the family, which are the scriptures they must read and study, and what should be their routine throughout the day, how much time they should devote for exercise, how much time they should devote for horse riding, how much time they should devote for reading the scriptures. Administration, you must go and sit in the administration office, which is called a third, every day, learn from so and so how to carry out the administration. So from a very young age, 5 or 6 years of age, they were introduced into this. Like Bajirao fought his first battle at 11 years of age, and they were taken with their fathers for campaigns and so on. And people in those days did not live long. I mean, 40 or 50 means you are a really an old man, probably people died by around 40 or 50. So they started very young. So by 19 or 20, all the Peshwas came to the throne before they became the Peshwas before the age of 20. So at that stage, whatever maturity they had was much more than today's 19-year-old boy. Probably because today's generation refused to hand it over to them. Or whatever.
Thank you.
I think there's a good documentation about the libraries of the Peshwai.
I want to ask a question. This is about Peshwas being indebted all the time, and yet they had the rights to Chauthai and Sardeshmukhi, which they could have collected and made good the loans they had taken. But there was no effective way of this collection. It always meant that they had to go to battle, collect that, and next time again the same thing happened. So repeatedly they were incurring more and more expenses to collect the revenues, and yet what then could be the effect?
Chauthai was state income. It was not their personal income. So there was a clear difference between the two. In fact, in some letters it is mentioned who gets how much salary. The 8 Ashtapradhan who were there of Shivaji's time, how much salary per year is paid to each of them. So that is mentioned as a document of that kind. So the personal wealth is different and public wealth was different. Though there may be some admixture in some cases between these two cases. And the second question?
No, I was saying, could there be a more effective way of regular collection?
Yeah, but problem is that this, again, next book we'll come to it. There's a famous letter by Nanasaheb Peshwa, written half in jest with very, very flowery Marathi language, which I think should be part of MA Marathi curriculum today, because it was extremely difficult to translate that letter. He calls it the Suvarna Nadi, the rivers of gold from the north and the rivers of gold from the south. So he said till a certain time all these rivers of gold is to bring wealth and put it in the Kupa-like or the well-like capital at Pune. But in the middle period, this river which was flowing from the north and the south, it became dry. The ground in between became very arid and it used to seep in the soil. So in a way he's saying that a lot of money was embezzled and it never reached their central treasury. So human nature has not changed in the last 500 years.
Apropos what you said about about Fort William and all that, what was the Maratha ditch originally made for and by whom?
Actually, that comes in the next book, 1743, when the Raghuji Bhosle began his invasions of Bengal after 1740, 1741. The merchants of Bengal contributed a certain fund to build this ditch to protect Calcutta. But the Marathas that ditch was never completed. It was only half or 3/4 of the path it was dug up, and only a small part of it remains today, which is again a drainage canal which goes into the Hooghly. So this was built by the merchants, not necessarily by the East India Company, although the East India Company offered their engineering help and many projects were made because they thought this is going to be a perennial problem and we'll have to make that wall. But eventually Calcutta itself was never attacked by the Marathas. So that wall eventually ditch was made but never completed.
My question is in 2 parts. Firstly, why was Panipat only taken as a battlefield in successive 3 battles. And every time we lost, or the invader won and ruled India. And the second part is, I don't know, it must have been mentioned in your book, is the battles are won or lost because of the proper logistic and other supports. And managing these thousands of animals and people and men and what have you, how long did it take to reach, and how was it integrated with hardly any means of communication those days, which was only leadership, one-to-one?
It is just a coincidence that the 3 battles were fought at Panipat. There is no real reason. The Great Plains of the North started somewhere around there, and immediately the enemy came down across the 5 rivers of the Punjab and came into the plains. Probably Panipat was the first place where, because by the time he had crossed the 5 rivers, he was south of the Jamuna, and Delhi was an open, it was an open road to Delhi. So that was a point in time when he was the ruler of Delhi, probably went to stop him. If you look at the geographic reasons, and every battle had different reason why it happened. In Marathas didn't plan to have it in Panipat. It just happened that third battle fought there. For logistics was a different problem. Communications were poor. Letters took 45 days to reach from one place to the other. Armies moved slowly. They had heavy cannons. They had a lot of animals which had to go with them. They had several people to look after those animals, which are today derisively called as Bazar Bunge. Well, today the Indian army has got 4 fighting arms, but all the rest are supporting arms. So we can even call them Bazar Bunge today. I was in the Army Medical Corps. It's Bazar Bunge. So, but it's very necessary. I mean, who's going to look after the, suppose a horse loses a nail, is the soldier going to go and fix it? Who's going to look after the elephants? So there were a lot of duties which were distributed among these people, and they were the Bazar Bunges which went along with them. So every army, even today, has got the support services. But very often people call them Bazar Bunge in a way that, why would you take so many Bazar Bunge with you? Well, you can't take a huge army unless you're fighting a guerrilla war like Bajirao. He only took a cavalry-based army and only 2 people with 1 spare horse. And there was no other artillery or anything of that, except for very rare occasions, no elephants moving ponderously. That he did not need to take this. They lived off the land in the earlier part. By the time they reached Panipat, they stopped living off the land. They were the people who were occupying the land. So from a policy in the Indian Navy, we call it that the submarine warfare is a warfare of denial, sea denial, while the aircraft carrier warfare is of occupation. So from the times of Chhatrapati Shivaji, where forts were very important, you could attack the enemy and go back to the fort, which was denying the enemy peace on the plains. Situation had changed when plains had to be occupied and held. So that's why forts became less important and your presence on the ground became more important. So it was a change of warfare over the 1.5 centuries of that period.
Thank you so much. There is a wealth of information out here and all the panelists have a lot to share, but sadly we are bound by time limits. I thank you all, everyone in the audience, for being here and in being a part of this discussion. And I would like to thank Mr. Sahani and Arati and the Nehru Center for giving us an opportunity to discuss this wonderful book. All of us are definitely looking forward to meeting you again on the 29th of March for part 2 of the discussion on this trilogy of books on Nana Sahib Peshwa. Thank you so much. Thank you.
On behalf of the Nehru Center, I'd like to thank Dr. Kulkarni, Shri Amit Paranjape, Ms. Soniya Khare for having travelled all the way from Pune and graced us with their presence, and Dr. Gaurav Gadgil from our very own Mumbai, but in spite of his busy schedule, he has been here today. So thank you very much, all of you, for being here. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to having you again on 29th of March to continue this journey. Thank you so much.